Hello everybody, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. The Dark Frontier comes out the 9th of May, which is tomorrow. So you should be seeing this just before the entire set releases, and basically should be like something to watch in the downtime as we go over all of the cards that were spoiled today, which is many. There were many cards spoiled today. There was a huge batch of spoilers, not only the ones that were released with the community batch, but also a pile of them from Scarletch and other sources. So we're going to be going over all of them, breaking them down, and we are also going to be revealing our own spoiler, which we will be showing at the end of the video. So, to start things off, we have one of my favorites of the batch, Scarecrow, a 2/6 that says at the start of your turn, switch the strength and health of a unit of your choice. So, Scarecrow is a very good nightmare for creating some interesting twist mechanics, since anytime that you twist a unit with a Scarecrow on board, you can then untwist it at the start of your next turn by swapping the attack and health around, meaning that you can infinitely twist as long as you like, as long as you are just spending a normal amount of power to twist when you're doing it. So if you're looking at very expensive twist mechanics on very small units, Scarecrow is something that can feasibly help with that quite a bit. But it's also a card that kills many merchants and messes up a lot of interesting strategies. It allows you to damage units that have very high attack and very low health, or vice versa. Allows you to throw some like Vara's Favor stuff out there and like basically just blow up things that have one attack. You can do a lot of interesting things with Scarecrow. The main problem with the card, of course, is that it does do everything at the start of your turn, which means that it does not have a lot of onboard impact on the turn that it is played. Still, it's decently durable, so there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be able to get the things that it wants out of life. It can't be vanquished, and it can't be torched, and it can't be hit by Display of Instinct or any other big unit. It can block most things without having to deal with a lot of problems. Like, most of the time, the Scarecrow is going to be okay. And like, yeah, this card can typically at least get one flip. If you don't have any units and your opponent doesn't have any units, you will have to flip the Scarecrow, but that still gets you a 6/2 to attack with, which feels pretty reasonable. So, like, not really a bad deal. You can always flip units that have equal amounts of health and attack if you wish to. The one thing that Scarecrow cannot effectively scare is Acquisitive Crow, the one crow in the game, but that's kind of delightful. And generally true of Scarecrows anyways. Birds don't care. So, yeah, I think that's pretty interesting, and this card overall seems like a lot of fun. Should be really good for limited twist mechanics, and should be quite a bomb in limited. I think it's actually going to be a really fun card if you're playing it in any sort of draft or sealed mode. Next up is Cloud Snake Matriarch, and yes, that image was too small, but that's okay. We'll get ourselves back up. This was spoiled by the Reddit mods, I think. Oh, although I won't be able to adequately announce who spoiled what frequently. So, okay. Cloud Snake Matriarch is a 5/4 with flying and warp, and whenever you warp a card, including Cloud Snake Matriarch, draw a card. Very feast or famine on this one, because this is a card that specifically only gets the amount of card advantage that you want, which is to say it's a 2-card draw on a 5/4 flyer if you warp it, and it also allows you to warp other things to get tons and tons of advantage. If you play this card from your hand, it's a 5/4 flyer that probably dies immediately, and so that's a little bit less value and potentially not that strong a card. Some cool stuff going on with this card. One of the neat things about it is that it has a very different style of art than we're used to. You'll notice this is like a really just gorgeous painted background. Like, Direwolf Digital released this as a wallpaper because it's really pretty. Like, I'm very happy with this card's art overall. Like, it's just really neat. Yeah, I think overall this card is probably going to be like a stronger card in limited than it is in ranked. It's just like, it does support warp strategies, but not in like an amazing way, and I would say that like overall there's not too much to be excited about in terms of what this card does, but it's so much card advantage in sealed and draft that it's definitely a card that you're going to want to get to in those setups. Like, this is a card that if you get it in a sealed pack, you are really a lot better off, and you are probably going to be really happy to be grabbing uncommons like this. This is just a card that you really want to play in those situations, because it is just endless fonts of card advantage on a large evasive bomb, so what's not to love? Yeah, super strong for Primal in limited, and like, this card does have some synergy with a big ol' like, ranked shenanigans deck if you really want to play lots and lots of warp cards and get tons and tons of card advantage. You can do some pretty cool stuff. So yeah, it's very fun. All right, next up, Copperhall Chancellor was spoiled on one of the recent ones. I actually think we're going to go with all the ones that have like different art styles like this differently, because they tend to get lost. No, I found it. Okay, Copperhall Chancellor. We can just do this one at a time. The enemy player can't copy cards or play units with the same name as another one of their units, and onslaught strength and health equal to the highest strength amongst your other units. So this is a 1/1 that isn't particularly good on its own. Like, if you don't onslaught it, this card is really, really weak. The main advantage to it is that it gives you some kind of like decent distraction from your opponent. Like, it prevents your opponent from playing a bunch of cards that they would otherwise be able to play. Cards with the same name as another one of your units is actually a pretty big restriction. This can certainly shut down rats, shut down assembly lines, shut down piles of Varas, and many, many decks that just have 4 cards and happen to have a lot of interesting stuff in them. I'm a little interested in this card because, like, there are a lot of hate cards in this set. Dark Frontier has a surprising amount of restrictions. There are restrictions on different types of cards you can play, different colors. There are cards that specifically hate on tribal factions. We'll see a card later on that actually kills sentinels. There's some really interesting stuff out here that are like just specifically targeted at dealing with very particular things. There's a lot of merchant hate. There's a lot of interesting restrictions overall. So the limited format and the ranked format should both be pretty interesting, and I think meta is going to be like full of interesting answers to particular types of decks, and there will be a lot of breaking up of tribal and other types of particular strategies. I think we're going to be seeing a shift towards more balanced decks and more like ball of good stuff decks, so it's going to be interesting to see how well this affects things. Copperhall Chancellor, however, does get you to be a decent amount of damage. Justice does not typically have a lot of high strength units, so it's not always going to be the biggest thing in the world, but you can usually get this to be at least a 4/4 or something like that for 4, and that's not too bad. I think that's reasonable options, but also it's going to be hard to say exactly how good this is going to be. One thing it does play very well with is Hojin. If you can actually get a Hojin with like a Bear Guard Bayonet on this turn, then Copperhall Chancellor will be extremely large, and you won't have had to spend a lot to get a really aggressive unit out on board. So there are some cool things you can do with Chancellor to make it a big unit, but I think overall it's probably a little too weak to get major strength unless you are playing a deck that is specifically designed to play it out as a very, very big unit. If you've got a big unit with that kind of hate, then you feel really, really good about it. Corrupted Behemoth is our next card. And this one is a 4/6 with Overwhelm, and pay 3 to twist Corrupted Behemoth to gain 2 health. We've seen a lot of health-gaining dinosaurs. It's kind of a mild theme that there's a common health-gaining dinosaur in, I think, almost every set. They're typically not very good. This one's okay. Like, it's definitely not too bad in a limited format because it is a card that you can turn into a 5/5 while gaining 2 life, and it's got Overwhelm. But 5/5 Overwhelm for 5, that's not all that wild. Like, I would say this card is not super strong, and most of the time you're going to want to leave it as a 4/6 because that will give you better defense than gaining health. The twist ability is very expensive, so it's not wild, but if you're playing with a lot of dinosaurs, this is a reasonable card to be picking up in a draft, and I would say it's almost completely unplayable in ranked because there's just not too much else going on there. But yeah, like, there's a lot of good 5-drops, and some of them are already 4/6s. 4/6 is certainly not a bad stat line, and Overwhelm is definitely a useful skill in limited, so yeah, it's got some good stuff going on. So all right, next up. And, oh man, there's some good dino synergies going on. What else have we got? Let's see here. We got... Oh, no. That's something else. I just have a lot of random Jack memes in this folder for no reason. Okay. Bam. Sneaky Speaky. Sneaky Peeky. So Bam Sneaky Peeky is a 3/5 with when Bam attacks, play a 1/1 Yeti Spy. Shift 4, transform a card of your choice into the enemy market into a 1/1 Yeti Spy. So this turns a card into your opponent's market into a kind of useful card, which is interesting. Like, a 1/1 Yeti Spy is not the worst thing that you can pull out of your market, although it is pretty hard to pull out of your market if you're not a blue market. So, but yeah, Bam is pretty good overall. Like, this is a card that as a 3/5 for 4 is definitely not reasonably, like, it's pretty decent stat line. The attack ability plays Yeti Spies, which give you lots and lots of advantage, especially if you have cards like the Yeti a flinger out that deals damage for every unit, or causes every unit that comes out to play and deal damage. If you have cards like Wump out, you can play the Yeti Spies and immediately draw cards. So BAM plays really well in sort of like Yeti mid-range, which... yeah, that's always fun. The shift ability on this card means that you can play it and immediately mess with your opponent's market, and then later on get an unblockable unit that immediately plays a Yeti Spy. So you can wait until the appropriate time to play your Wump, draw the card for sure, and do some cool things. So yeah, Yeti midrange, Yeti control, let's do it. We've got the card that draws Yeti Pult. We have like some really interesting other options. Like, I'm really looking forward to Yeti midrange. I like Yeti midrange better than Yeti aggro, so I'm pretty down for this card. This is like a lot of fun, and it's a decent card in limited as well. There's certainly no reason not to play it. It draws you a bunch of cards, and it is relatively solid in terms of the overall advantage that it gives. Plus, like, messing with opponents' markets is fun, even in draft, which I don't think you're ever really going to get that to happen in draft, because most of the time people won't have a market, but every now and then. Okay, this one was really strong when it was shown off. Embargo Officer, 2/1, cards can't leave markets or voids with a shift of 2. So for a more expensive price, you can shift this card, basically have it be completely invulnerable to any targeted effects, as well as any damage from killer or weapons or curses. And then, like, for 3 turns, your opponent can't use markets or throw things out of their void. And then later on, if it shifts back in, you can shift it out again and continue to have it be relatively invulnerable. Or you can protect it with Aegis, or you can use counterspells. Like, this is a really decent option for actually shutting down markets in that respect. However, the thing about Embargo Officer is that it is a lot of tempo disadvantage on turn 2. If you are playing this card out, like, you don't get much more than a 2/1 unblockable unit, which kind of shuts off markets. So, like, people will have, like, less to do, but they will be more capable of just killing you with aggro. So oftentimes you're actually going to want to play Embargo Officer on 1 and just leave it out, and that's a little bit more dangerous. This card is much more likely to die then, and then actually leave your opponent with the ability to grab stuff from their market. So it's not a perfect answer, but it definitely has vulnerabilities. It's got interesting play patterns. I like the interesting play pattern aspect to it, and I think that as long as that play pattern remains interesting, and there's a lot of different ways to interact with and play Embargo Officer, a lot of different choices you have to make, this is a fine market hate card and should be really, really solid. It's definitely the strongest market hate card that we have seen released, and like overall 2/1s for 1 are usually pretty decent, so this seems like a solid rare. And if you really don't like markets, it's the way to go. All right, next up, we got, what's this? Interjection. Oh, whoops. Crap my own thing. All right, we do that every now and then. Yeah, this is like another meme from the thing. Kill the main character of the campaign. The protagonist is now get check. All right. So, we have Fragility. Fragility is when the cursed unit takes damage, kill it for 2. This is like a okay curse, but it's not like a particularly strong one. It's something you definitely pick up in limited formats if you want to like do damage to people with Stormcaller and mess up their strategies. It's overall like fairly light removal that is not going to be fairly high picked. This is something that you pick up if you have very good synergy for it, and otherwise you don't really play it a lot. But if you have a lot of interesting ways to actually deal small amounts of damage to units, you might want this to pick up big units in blue, because blue has a problem with killing big units in general, and this is something that actually allows you to do that. I don't see it playing a lot in ranked, but every now and then you might actually want to have like a bunch of curses in your void for some reason. That could be something that actually gives you some benefits. All right, Frost Elemental. This is flying onslaught. Each shifted enemy unit takes 1 additional turn to emerge. So essentially, it is a 3-cost that just makes everything a little bit harder to play in shift. 3-cost 3/3 flyer is a reasonable stat line. We haven't seen a lot of cards that actually have managed to pull this off. Like Valkyrie Enforcer does it really well, Cloudsnake Harrier doesn't. So the difference between whether or not this card is good or not is a little hard to parse. But I would say that overall, it's very well statted for its cost, and it's super good tempo, and you can play it in the same form as Cloud Snake, or as Valkyrie Enforcer. So if you want to play blue Fliers, this is a card that really supports that strategy. The delay to shift is maybe not going to be that big a deal, but it is one-sided, so that's really, really nice. And I think that, like, overall, if you are actually shutting down your opponent's shift strategy with this, while also doing all of your scary flying stuff, then yeah, that's Frost Elemental's ideal world. I think they're super happy to be living in that world, so it's worth giving it a shot. Okay. Next up, we have Nimble Conscript. Nimble Conscript is a reckless 3/4 with shift 1, so you can play it for 1 to basically just have a Nimble Conscript on turn 4, which is fine. It will be aggressive, it will have reckless, it will not be torchable. It's a reasonably aggressive unit, and a 3/4 is a really interesting stat line on a red aggressive unit. I think these kinds of like high health reckless units are an interesting design space to play in for red, and certainly something that they can do where they have something that is just like good at actually being defensive, but also has some cool shift strategies and like, yeah, some cool stuff going on. So yeah, there's decent alternate mechanics for this card. It can carry weapons, it can be just a unit that you play on 3 and it's really, really well statted, but it has to keep attacking. This is a clear weapon carrier for red, and I think it's actually a power mover in any type of limited aggro deck that you want to build that has like a lot of decent aggression to it. So yeah, Nimble Conscript should be worth playing. I don't know if you want to shift it on 1 as much as you want to play it on 3, but like this is definitely a card that gives you that choice, and having that modality is really, really important. A lot of the shift cards in this format have good modality, so like that's something that like really improves their ability to be played and like sort of allows for some really interesting mechanics. I will say this is probably one of the most complicated sets mechanically in terms of like how the board state is going to be playing. It's going to be really interesting. I think it's very high level play. There'll be some room for pretty high level play in this set. Garmaster Sandmage. Oh, he's over here. All right, 1 cost 2/1. When an enemy unit is played, silence it. Shift 5, silence each unit in the enemy player's hand. So typically you want to play this as a 1. The shift 5 is interesting if you are in a situation where your opponent has just a pile of units in their hand, but I can't think of too many situations where that's actually going to be the case. Most of the time this is going to be something that you're actually pretty comfy playing on 1 and then like just being able to knock down Fliers with and do aggressive things. I think it's okay in terms of power level. Like it's certainly not bad because it is a 1-drop that has a relatively useful top deck thing where you can just like sort of mess with your opponent's Fliers. But like the top deck is basically you're shifting a unit that doesn't have any board presence to allow your opponent to still play cards that have board presence, but they are silenced. And also, they have to have those cards in their hand, you have to know those cards are in their hand, and like the chance that it hits 2 of them is pretty weak. I think that's not a terribly likely proposition. Still, 2/1 for 1, that is a strong stat line. As far as I can tell, like most of these cards are still very, very good in aggressive decks, and like cards that have that kind of extra modality do help quite a bit. So this one's a little weird because I don't like the shift at all, but I'm okay with the 1-drop, and the 1-drop does prevent Fliers from flying over your head, which is a fancy way to deal with Huru decks if you're having problems. So yeah, pretty down on it. Okay, Godin, Undefeated. All right, Onis. Did you know Onis are like a strict cased system of weapons where like everyone sort of has their own weapon-based case? So every time you see a gunslinger Oni, that is someone who is somewhat heretical, and I don't think you can argue with the results. This is Godin, Undefeated. 5 cost in 5 fire with warp and charge, and that charge is a particularly good thing. So like I would say that like basically just this being a charge warp for 5 makes it perfectly reasonable in any fire deck. The question is, are you going to be able to run it in other decks? And I think Stonescar Gunslingers is a decent chance at this, just because this is something where you're already playing as many like fire and shadow cards that actually play both as you can, so that you can play cards like Champion of Chaos. With the new Stonescar I can't remember what it's called. I think it's a Seals Insignia, Stonescar Insignia. This is actually a really playable card in that type of gunslinger setup, and you might be able to play it in Onis in a different setup too. Could be okay in Rakano with maybe like maybe we could actually see Aegon's Workshop being played. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, overall, Godin's major benefits are to smaller units like Gunslingers and Oni, where you actually get like lots of small units out and get to just consistently warp all of those small units over and over and over again after your opponent has already spent a lot of effort to destroy those small units, and then you play a big unit that is much harder to kill. But there are some clear weaknesses, like this card can easily get vanquished or annihilated. It's not typically going to get that warp ability. When it does, it will win the game, and that's going to be really, really solid. This is definitely a high-impact card, and it has very good onboard impact, so I'm definitely not ruling it out. I would say that this is something that I'm really going to want for Stonescar Gunslinger decks, and I'm hoping that it sees some play in like infinite warp combo decks, but I'm not sure if that's going to be something that actually happens. And if it does, it might be using that 2 cost that gives everything warp, as opposed to something like Godin where all of your stuff just has warp all the time. Still, this is fun, and all of your stuff having warp all the time is really, really useful. Godin does hit more cards in your deck than any other card that gives things warp, including the card that gives power things warp, because typically you will have higher than 25 units in your deck, which means that over a third of your deck will be units, and it's pretty hard for over a third of your deck to be spells. So yeah, very, very strong stat line for its ability, and like obviously really good. That high influence cost is going to limit where it's played, but where it's played, it should be very strong. So all right, Goldmine. This is from one of the new decks. It is at the end of your turn, if the enemy player took 3 or more damage, create and draw a treasure trove. So I like this card a lot, obviously. It's really, really good with onslaught shenanigans where you're trying to attack in constantly. It's a really fun card overall. Like, this is just extra cards for what you're planning to do normally. And I think that if you're playing like a decently aggressive deck with some cool spellcraft stuff going on, this is a pretty fun card. I don't know if you can specifically play it in Cradle, just because like Cradle is like a little bit hard to actually play more relics than the Cradle themselves, but it is something that creates many, many treasure troves, and if you can figure out some way to reduce the cost of the treasure troves, discard the treasure troves for cool abilities, or do something useful with the treasure troves, aside from just drawing cards at an extra 2 cost, then I think Goldmine definitely gives you a lot to play with. So there's a definite balance to strike here between aggressiveness and playing the sort of like aggressive like control stuff where you are basically just playing 2 more for everything, but you get a ton of cards off of this card if you're playing it right, and there are definitely decks that play it right, and those decks are a lot of fun to play. This is like one of my favorite type of Johnny cards to build around, just because it does like, yeah, it does really, really interesting things. Like, it's just a wild time, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. That's a potato. All right, next up is we've got Guns Blazing. 2 cost warp, give a unit quick draw this turn. So this is a card that specifically allows you to give you a very nice little trick. It's similar to Trick Shot, but it's got that warp ability to it too, which is really, really neat. I love warp tricks. I actually really love warp fast spell tricks. This is something where like there was a card called Hip Shot that came out that was a slow spell with warp, and it was like, it was a card that I understood why they didn't make it a card that you could play off the top of your deck at fast spell speed, but I always wanted it to happen. This is a card where you are attacking in on an empty board, and you have nothing in your hand, and your opponent is like, well, I might as well block that thing, right? And then you Guns Blazing, and you get the benefit, and that's really, really fun. I would say overall it's not very strong. I'm not even sure if it's strong in limited, because it's just got so very limited potential, and warp cards tend to force you to adapt a pattern in limited where you just have to get that advantage or else you're going to get kind of left behind. But still, it's a decent enough trick. I feel like it's just not going to be all that reasonable, but it's got some potential in limited formats, and it'd be really, really fun in a couple of warp decks. I don't think it would be very good in any of those warp decks, so that's okay. All right, Heartstopper. This one's got flying, and for some reason is 100 times larger than everything else. All right. I loved the spoiler releases for this round, but they did all come in very different sizes. A 3/4 flyer that says when the first time the enemy player discards a card each turn, you draw it. Which, wow, yeah, that's a really, really fun one. So this turns basically all mill decks into much more interactive and entertaining decks. If you want to do stuff with the Spore Crawler or the Spore Folk that is like a 0/4 that you mill people, if you want to play the 1 cost card that we're going to see a little bit later that mills people, if you want to do anything that actually discards cards from your opponent's deck as a in addition to their hand, you can now steal a bunch of their stuff with a 3/4 unit that is actually reasonably durable. 3/4 is a good stat line for staying alive. We always care about Torch and Vanquish a little bit, and this is something that doesn't die to either of them, so yeah, reasonable option. Is a little bit on the weak side, but should be able to live most of the time at least long enough to steal 1 unit. And if you're playing this like into a power or something like that, then you have to do some cool things. So yeah, it's a fun mill enabler. It's really, really interesting. It's definitely a cool build around me card. There are obviously better things in the 4 slot, but like this is still really, really cool. And big flyers with a little bit of oomph to them definitely feel really strong. So nothing wrong with something that gives you that much card advantage, and especially when you're stealing that card advantage directly from your opponent's hand with sabotage and shakedown and all of the shenanigans. I think that's a really, really reasonable. So, okay. Next up, we have... Okay, that's Heartstopper. So this is Caleb's Persuader. Caleb's Persuader is a 3/3/4/4 that when the field wielder attacks, they deal 2 damage to the enemy player, and you draw a fire sigil from their deck, because diplomacy is underrated. I love this card. So there's a bunch of good things going on here. One, it's a fairly cheap option that is like a mini Deep Forge Plate. We have seen cards like this before, like that are actually quite viable. People play Morningstar as a 3/3 Overwhelm unit because it allows you to get damage through on units without paying the full cost of Deep Forge Plate, and that is something that you're actually really happy to do. Caleb's Persuader allows you to deal 2 damage to the enemy player and without having to have Overwhelm, but it also does the damage from the unit. It is not a Caleb's Favor, it is a Caleb's Persuader. So the unit itself is doing damage, which means you trigger infiltrates, you trigger any sort of on-hit abilities, you trigger cards like Sill twice. You can do really, really interesting things with that. And then you also get a card back the turn that you play it, which is nuts. The fact that this card replaces itself with a power and just allows you to curve into your 5-drop, whatever that is, means that I think it's a very, very playable fire card in any type of deck that wants to play lots and lots of units. And like, yeah, this card plays well with lifesteal units, it plays well with aggressive stuff, it plays well with deadly stuff. Like, I think it's decently okay. It doesn't actually do a lot of stuff with deadly, but like nonetheless, you get to attack with deadly units and still have Caleb's Persuader on top, so yeah, that's really reasonable. Like, I'd say that like overall this card is just like really, really good, and also Caleb's just like such a dork, and I love that he named his gun the Persuader, because I mean, yeah, that's very Caleb. What can I tell you? Okay, Kimmy Expedition Guide. This one's a really cool design. So it's another Explorer Gunslinger, and for some reason it's tiny, but it is a 1/4, and when Kimmy attacks, play a shifted 1/1 Explorer, then your shifted units get +1/+1. So, yeah, obviously there are a lot of different things going on here, but Dinosaur Explorers are getting about as complicated as Explorer Sentinels now, and that's really, really fun to see. I like that this card is like a Shadowlands Expedition Guide, I think. I'm guessing that's what's going on with it. And, like, overall, there are a lot of cool things going on with this. So, it doesn't have any onboard impact, but it does allow you to shift out extra Explorers, which they aren't units that you can use immediately, but your shifted units do get a +1/+1 bonus, so it's going to be a 2/2 Explorer immediately, and then your other Explorers are going to get bigger over time, so every time it attacks, it basically just builds an army. That's pretty wild, and then this card is also a Dinosaur, which means that it plays well with all sorts of Explorer Dinosaur extra stuff. So if you want to play Evelina Valley Searcher, that turns Kimmy into a 2/5, then Kimmy can attack to give all of the Explorers with Shift like a little bit of extra benefits. You can shift this card in and out with Phase Out. You can do some really interesting things. So yeah, this is pretty cool. There's plenty of fun stuff that you can do with it. The main disadvantage to it is that it doesn't do any damage, and the shifted units don't get to be impactful for a while, so it may not even be as good as the 2/4 Amaran Stinger, but like, boy, is it fun. I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want to play with this card. It's just really, really wild, and it does many, many cool things with both Explorers and Dinosaurs. So yeah, no objections to that. Alright, Death Ripple. Kill an enemy unit with cost 4 or less. There's that art. I think it's actually a shifted unit getting killed by a dinosaur, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, 4/3, that alone is a pretty useful ability. That your shifted units get +2 strength is the other thing that happens there. But like mainly this is a really strong limited removal card. Extinguish was kind of playable, but the main problem was that it had Nightfall, and then that meant that your opponent just replaced whatever they got immediately. Death Ripple actually kills units. Like this is something that will get rid of a lot of your opponent's army very early. I would stack up on as many of these as you can in a draft format because it's really, really powerful removal that hits a lot of different targets. And then if you have any amount of shift units, then you get a ton of extra damage out of it later on. So yeah, that's wild. The shifted units ability is not going to be terribly relevant most of the time, but this is still something that you're super happy to get into, and like the removal cost is good enough that you might even be able to use it in ranked. I would say that like 4 or less is just on the fringe end of playable, and at least allows you to like play around with 4-cost units. So yeah, like I would say that there's some potential for this card to actually be decent. So seems okay. Should even be something that you could play in a couple of ranked setups. Definitely a strong limited card. Maybe too strong a limited card just because it's such good removal, and the shift ability is like, just like, you know, it's fine. Lethrai Soothsayer, oh my goodness, I'm so happy about this one. Okay, Lethrai Soothsayer is a 2/4/4/4 with Flying Onslaught. Put 7 Premonition Bolts into your deck. Let's take a quick look at that art before we look at 7 Premonition Bolts, because that's cool. This is like a very, very sweet looking elf, like sort of standing over their crystal ball and just like projecting energy into it. How delightful is that? That's good flavor. I like that. I like the concept of like seeing the future and then zapping it with electricity. Also, I love Static Bolt, and I love like decks that have bolts in them. There's just something about blue damage that I really, really like. And the Premonition Bolt itself is right here. It is a 0 cost. It has Warp. It says deal 3 damage to an enemy. Yeah, that's good. So this card provides you with 21 points of free damage, not counting spell damage effects, in your deck, which you definitely aren't going to be able to play all of them, or even all that many of them. It's about a 1 in 10 of drawing it every single turn. But like, even if you play one of these, like, that's reasonable. You played a 4-cost 2/4 with Flying, or did it have Flying? I'm not even gonna look. You played a decently good unit and you got some good bolts out of it. I think I'm super awesome. Like, that's just so much fun. And every time you draw one of these, like, this is more exciting to me than Dragon's Eyes. I just love the idea of having free torches stuck inside my deck that I can warp out. And yeah, it's crazy, crazy cool. This is also a really good card for any Caldera Cradle style deck where you actually want to have 0-cost cards that you can warp. You can use cards like Levitate and other draw spells to get yourself digging through your deck as fast as possible, and then you can like just sort of do some pretty cool stuff. Lore question: is the bolt seeing the future, or is the elf just seeing a lightning storm in the future? Well, the elf is projecting the lightning directly into the orb, so I assume that they're zapping the future with their lightning. But yeah, like I would say that like I'm really excited for this card. This is a really, really fun design. It's an absolute blast to get in draft. It's a complete draft bomb, and like if you're playing it in ranked, like I'm gonna be messenger hawking this thing because it's just too much fun and I want to repeat it over and over again. New tomorrow, all of the shenanigans to make your deck smaller. Play the end is near to get rid of all the power in your deck so you have a better chance of drawing Premonition Bolts. Yeah, there's some fun stuff there. I'm very, very into it, and I'm really looking forward to that whole setup. That should be very, very good. Here's a Juxtitude. Okay, next up we have so that was Premonition Bolt, and I started with Soothsayer. So Malediction is next up. And this one is enormous. Alright, Malediction is a 4-cost for 2 shadow that reads all units get -3/-3 this turn, which essentially is just going to like allow you to do lightning storm, hailstorm shenanigans in shadow, but like, yeah, like that's basically it. It's a hailstorm in shadow. I think that's actually really decent. Like, this is something you're pretty happy to get out of a market and allows you to shut down a lot of Rakano aggro type stuff. End of the line was something that was filling this void before, but like overall this card is pretty badass. Like, it is something that actually allows you to sort of mess up your opponent's stuff and deal with a lot of interesting, scary things. If you're playing cards that have 4 health or more pretty frequently, then you can reuse Malediction to clear out boards and do pretty nasty things. like, I don't know. I think this card is very, very strong, and there's some decent potential for it to actually be used in other setups. It's not as good as Hailstorm at shutting down aggro, but, like, it is nonetheless a Hailstorm in Shadow, which means that you don't have to go into Primal to play your Shadow control. And you can play your Shadow control in other colors if you want to, or just do Mono Shadow control. For a Mono Shadow deck, this is a really good toolkit card to make sure that you don't get murdered by aggro stuff, and I think that's very, very reasonable. So, yeah, I'm very high on this card. It's obviously a great card to get in draft. It's actually the first Hailstorm effect that you can get in draft, because Hailstorm was in fact a card that you previously only got out of the campaigns. So now you can play Hailstorm in draft, which is, yeah, that's scary. That's real scary. Seems like a pretty solid rare. Overall, pretty down on this, or pretty into this one, and we're gonna go on to the next one, but certainly keep an eye on it. Muck Crawler. This is a 1/1 with +2/+2 while you have a shifted unit. There are plenty of cheap shifted units, so there's pretty good ways to actually get Muck Crawler out there. If you want to play red aggro with that 3/4 charge unit, that seems like a really good place to throw Muck Crawler in. Yeah, this card's decently strong. It's going to be a 3/3 a lot of the time, and 3/3s for 1 are definitely not bad. I don't know if it's as strong as, say, Lucky Prospector, which had Endurance in addition to other things going on. You will frequently have shifted units with Muck Crawler, but also shifted units tend to represent board disadvantage, which is not generally suited for aggro. So whether or not Muck Crawler will be good or not is going to be an interesting question, and I'm not entirely certain what the answer is on that one. Once we have seen all of the shift cards in the set, we'll have a better idea of how good that is. At the moment, I'm going to say it's actually pretty mediocre, and there's a decent possibility that it's actually not going to be all that solid. More Jack. Good. Jack memes. This one is the favorite one that I've seen. I can't remember who made this one, but kudos to them. It was great. All right. So we've got Patience from the upcoming set, Dark Frontier. 3 cost, increase the cost of each card in the enemy hand by 1. I think this card's terrible. It's kind of like a cheaper version of Curse of Taxation, which messes up your opponent's stuff, and like, you know, like that wasn't a very good card at 4. This one is kind of a better effect because it actually does affect your opponent a little bit faster, but it's also a worse effect because it doesn't affect anything else that they draw after that. So like, they're still going to be able to play every card that they top deck, and you're not going to be able to consistently patience them over and over again. I don't know, this is the kind of card that I feel like is going to get repeated somehow. Somebody's going to figure out a way to play Patience over and over and over again, and when that happens, the deck is interminable. In any other situation, it's a bad card, so yeah, I'm not wild about this one. It's okay in like Elysian aggro stuff where you're trying to shut down your opponent's hand with like slow-based effects, but I feel like it's not strong enough, and that's a good thing, but also why bother on that front? Next up is Read the Runes. Okay, Read the Runes is negate an enemy spell with cost 4 or more, draw a card. So that is a 2 cost that says, yeah, it's a decently good removal spell, and it also allows you to draw a card, but it's double blue. So yeah, you're not going to hit that many things with Read the Runes, which is kind of the big disadvantage to that. We've seen a lot of interesting conditional counterspells, and this is one of the more interesting ones that we have seen. Direwolf's counterspell design is generally very, very careful, but I really love the draw a card aspect to this, so I think that overall this seems like it's just going to be something that you're reasonably okay with having. Potentially you can even give your opponent some cool spells through some other ability and then use that to draw cards later. Like if you have some way to trade them for cool options, like if you're playing, say, I don't know, Aurelian with Delith, you can be more likely to hand them big spells and actually expect them to use them. You can do some other things to sort of make this a little bit more viable, but the real question is, what kind of meta runs a lot of spells with 4 cost or more? The answer is quite a few. Like there are definitely a lot of setups that run Feeding Time, In Cold Blood, Death Strike as like their primary removal cards. So like those are things that you can definitely do things with. It also allows you to counter spells off of sites, like Withstand from Koravat Palace, and that's a fairly common one. You can also counter the 5 can't even remember the name. It's a shot, but it deals 5 damage to a unit without quick draw off of Howling Peak. So yeah, some sight spells will actually be something that you can counter, and that's really, really reasonable. So seems like some good options, and like overall there should be some targets for Read the Runes. This is a card that I can definitely see running as many as 4 of in a deck if you're playing the particular type of deck that you want to run, which is probably aggressive Flyers, and there is a new aggressive Flyer at 3. Well, deep mono blue aggressive Flyers feels like a pretty strong one. I think this might actually have some potential. Yeah, all of the counter spells are interesting. All of them play in different decks, and it's really dependent on the meta which one is good, but this is a very worthy addition, and I think it's relatively strong. Probably stronger than Backlash, Spell Swipe, maybe not as strong as Unseal, maybe not as strong as Steely Resolve. I like Steely Resolve a lot more than other people do, though. I think this is actually a little stronger than Steely Resolve. Alright, Reclaim. So, Reclaim is 2 Justice Sigils from your deck. Onslaught, play them instead. Definitely a good way to ramp if you're in green. Overall, like, cards definitely seems like it's going to be getting you from big to very big very quickly. It's a solid way to build up on, like, Martyr's Chains, which that actually is like the only thing that has me turned against this card. I love Martial Ironthorn decks. I love Justice Ramp decks, but like right now Justice Ramp decks don't have anything to do other than play Martyr's Chains. There's Svetcha, but like Martyr's Chains is just better than Svetcha in most situations. So like until Martyr's Chains gets a change, I'm not really sure that I like Reclaim all that much. Still, it's an interesting limited card. It actually allows you to play some really, really big stuff in green limited, and like the Onslaught ability is really cool on that front. It's a little better than Privilege of Rank in some scenarios, and that's really cool. I like the design of this card a lot. If Justice gets better top end by way of like getting rid of what their current top end is, then I'm super down with this. There's a lot of fun Justice top end that you can play with, but right now it's a lot of Talut and Martyr's Chains, and neither of those cards have been like, they've been okay in the meta. Talut is kind of fun. Martyr's Chains is just, yeah, it's a difficult experience. All right, next up, we are gonna play some... That was Reclaim. Next up is Relentless Deadshot. There are so many spoilers, you guys. 2 cost 2/2, pay 3 and twist Relentless Deadshot to stun an enemy unit. So this is a really reasonable twist card, because the twist ability is something that you are absolutely happy to get. And it's on a 2/2 Lifesteal Gunslinger, which is nuts. There was a 2/2 Lifesteal unit in green very, very early on. It was called Crownwatch Commando, I think. This one is just solid. Like, it is a very good carrier for weapons. Justice has the best weapons, so this is something that you're actually really, really happy to see. Compared to the 2 cost 2/2 in Shadow, like, this is a huge improvement, not only because it's a better type, it's a gunslinger, but also because it's a card that has, like, basically, like, a better color base to play weapons on and play interesting shenanigans. Like, this is really, really good stuff. And then, like, yeah, the twist ability is really, really strong. It turns it into a 3/1, but it also stuns a unit. If you buff this up with weapons, it allows you to stun units endlessly for 3, which is a very big deal. This card is kind of game-winning, and I think it's one of the better 2-drops that we've seen. There are a lot of good 2-drops in green, and that's the only thing that kind of makes this a little bit worse, is that, like, you know, you're playing this alongside Hojin, you're playing this alongside Crownrush Paladin. I think it's maybe better than Crownrush Paladin. It's very, very strong. There's a lot of cool stuff going on with it, so yeah, good things. All right. Here there's a new spoiler, so let's see what it is. Oh, there's several new spoilers. We haven't seen Streets of Flame yet, so I'll just go ahead and download that. Streets of Flame. And there's also Waystone Elemental. We'll get to both of these. Let's do these right now. So there's a lot of spoilers happening. All right. Next up. All right, Streets of Flame. So Streets of Flame is a 3-cost, deal 3 damage, and scout at a fast spell speed. That's an expensive torch, but it's certainly a torch, and it's actually a pretty good torch. It's even a torch that I would run over torch in some scenarios if I'm feeling very, very comfy in my ability to deal damage. Some interesting things going on here. This is a Skycrag town, I think. It's actually up in the mountains, and there's a bunch of crows floating around, so I'm curious as to why the streets would be aflame in a Skycrag town, but let's find out, I guess, in the storyline up ahead. This is kind of cool. I like this design a lot. Fast spell speed torches bonuses are really good. This plays well with spell damage. Scout abilities are really useful, and there's a bunch of cards that actually support scouting right now in the set. There are a lot of cards with scout. This could be like unofficially the 4th or 5th mechanic of the set, in addition to warp. So like scout supports warp a lot, which is really, really nice. And like, yeah, this is a card that I think is very good design overall. It's a very, very strong limited card. You always want torches, even if they're 3-cost torches, and like, yeah, that's something that you're absolutely going to be happy to get in limited. Playing it in ranked is a little bit harder, but that's okay. Well, the other one was called Waystone, but I don't seem to have it there, so we'll see if we run into it. Okay. Relentless Deadshot trends into Search Party. Warp, pay 2 1/1 Explorers for 3. So this gets you some cheap Explorers. I'm not too down on that. It's an okay warp card overall. Like, it definitely gets you sort of in the same vein as Assembly Line, but it's a little bit harder to use, and it's a little bit more card efficient, which is kind of the way of time in general. I'd say for playing cheap chump blockers while also drawing into other things, this card actually seems like it's going to be reasonable in ranked. There's not really a reason not to play it. It's okay at doing what it does, which is just basically allowing you to have a couple blockers, keep yourself from getting burned down by mid-range stuff, get some tokens to keep yourself away from Vara, which is really, really nice. Like, this is fine card draw overall, and if you don't card draw with it, then you can at least use it to trigger Praxis Arcanum or Vault of the Praxis later on, which, yeah, seems like a reasonable option in Praxis tokens. You could definitely play this card in any sort of spell-based or Assembly Line-based deck, although it's not going to be quite as powerful as Assembly Line, which is an outrageous card in Fire. So, but, yeah, like if you want to play Praxis tokens without the Praxis, that's got some potential. I think that's definitely quite awesome. All right, we're skipping over to the next card. So people who've been paying attention probably know what it is by now. But Slag is our next card. 2-cost, kill an enemy relic or kill an enemy sentinel. Oh, that poor sentinel. So this doesn't kill attachments, it just kills relics. So it's definitely a market card. But as a market card, it's a market card that immediately kills a sentinel, which that makes sentinels a little bit worse. So if you were thinking that sentinels were very, very strong, this is a card that seems like a really reasonable option to throw into the setup. The one nice thing about Slag, I think, is that it is a card that if people have it in their deck, they're less likely to have Boar, which means that I can play my Crown decks again, and also, like, people who are actually trying to deal with the competitive decks, like Firetime Primal, will not be, like, blowing my stuff up in the same way. So I'm totally on board with Slag. I like these attachment destruction cards, and this one seems like it's pretty reasonable. It is a hate card for Sentinels, and Sentinels are really fun units, but, like, yeah, sure. Sentinels could use a hate card, and Red could really use a way to deal with Sentinels, because they've never been able to deal with units that have 6 health. So this is something that actually gives them a decently strong option against that, and certainly in a decent way. So feels like a very good market card, should be a really strong card for East Annex to be grabbing, and like, yeah, that kind of thing is actually really important for upcoming setups. All right, Nico's the Unifier. Lifesteal 5/5, summon all shifted units emerge. You know, his heart's in the right place. So, yeah, this is an okay effect. I figured there would be something along those lines in the set, and I'm kind of glad to see it where it is. At 6 cost, it's about right. This is typically going to be game-winning if you have a bunch of shifted units out in very, very cheap setups, but it also allows you to turn off all of your opponent's shift stuff by making it emerge too early and removing the unblockability from it, because it'll get unblockable that turn, and then it won't be able to attack with unblockable the next turn. It's a 5/5 lifesteal, so it plays pretty well. It's not stat efficient, and if it does actually emerge all of your opponent's shift units, you could end up in trouble depending on what kind of shift units those are. So there are potentially some issues with this card, but I think that overall it's a reasonable answer to shifted units, and it's a very good card to be throwing into a market. So seems like a market legendary, but potentially you could play as many as 4 of them if your deck also contains a lot of shift units that you want to get out very, very quick. So seems pretty cool. All right, Spyglass. When the wielder attacks, scout. This is a 1/1, and after you've scouted 6 times, sacrifice Spyglass to play 4 1/1 Yeti Spies. Reasonable option for building around in draft. If you get this rare, it's definitely a lot of fun. There's a lot of good scout cards in draft, and I think that's a very, very strong option. If you want to build like a Pauper Scout deck, I think that's pretty good too. I don't think this is going to belong in a tier 1 deck. It's a little bit too... I don't know, 1-cost 1/1 weapons are actually decent. They're not terribly unreasonable, but like you don't get a scout off of this immediately. Oh, you do get a scout off of this immediately. So 1 cost for a +1/+1 bonus and a scout. and then you also have a sort of later option. I can see it, but a scouting party is still like a pretty minimal payoff, so I don't think this is quite playable in ranked, but it's a little bit tricky to say whether or not that's going to be any good. Overall, it's definitely not bad, but there are some possibilities where it's just not quite going to be all that good. So let's see here. Next up, we have... That's not it. Got malediction. Are we into Ollie? There are a lot of cards, you guys. A lot of them. Stone Hewer's next. Okay. Shift 2-1. Whenever Stone Hewer emerges, you get +2 power this turn. Yeah, this one's fairly reasonable. Like, you get some good stuff happening there. Like, I love this card just because I really love rituals, and this is one of the more interesting rituals out there. It's basically bank 2 power to get 2 power and a 2-1 later on, which... yeah, I'm super into that. This allows you to, on turn 5, play yourself into 7 power, which allows you to play cards like Kenedins very easily. You can also Combustion Cell this up to 9. You can do this with Combustion Cell to create like very, very big end of the barrels. You can typically generate just a pile of power with this and end of the barrel together, as well as Combustion Cell. So like, yeah, there's a lot of interesting shenanigans there. So I think that's really, really reasonable. So like overall, I think it's okay. And also you can shift this card back later on to get the extra power back later. So yeah, this is fun jank. It definitely does some really cool ritual stuff. I think it's stronger than Kindle, not as strong as End of the Barrel, but like overall actually a really good setup on 2 for a very big turn later on. And there are some really, really big turns that you can pull in Fire and Primal. So this is an interesting Kenedins card for an alternate style of Kenedins, and we love these types of cards in general. And yeah, like I can see this pulling into some really interesting combos overall, so I'm very, very down with it. One of the interesting things about shift cards is that they play really well with demand death. If you want to like demand death on the turn before a bunch of your shift cards emerge, then you can feasibly get some very interesting benefits, or the turn after for that matter, because you'll have like sort of basically shift cards tend to come out in like sort of waves alongside your own units, so you can do some cool stuff with that. Yeah, but yeah, Stone Hewer's got some cool properties, and I'm really hoping that it makes it into a ranked deck somewhere. As a 1-cost 2-1, it is definitely viable in a draft deck, although it's not the rare that you most want to see. It is nonetheless a rare you should pick, because it's decently aggressive, and you're never going to shift it in those scenarios. You'll just play it as a 1-drop, but hey. Okay, Tameras Earthshaker. This card's really decent. It's a 4/6 flying. Shift 3, deal 1 damage to each enemy without flying. So it's basically got, as soon as you shift it, which is the cost of 3, you get yourself a Tameras later on in the game, but you also get to immediately kill all of the small units, you get to deal damage to sites, and you get to kill shifted units like the one that we just saw, which is really, really important. Remember that non-targeted abilities are actually really, really high value right now, because anything that allows you to actually damage or mess with your opponent's stuff when it's shifted is going to be really useful in the upcoming meta. Tameras is like overall not a well-statted flyer, but a 4/6 is still pretty viable and durable, and this card only costs 3 to play, so if you're doing something else on 3 that's really worth it, then I can see this card not being all that good, but if you aren't, then yeah, there's no reason not to grab it. It's a really good flyer, it does good blocking stuff, and like, yeah, Eternal's best dressed. Glad to see another Tameras card, hoping to see a little bit more Tameras in the plot, because she seems like an interesting character, and I hope she has some relevance later on in the whole setup. If you're wondering who Tameras is in the lore, after Caleb goes to the Sunken Tower, Tameras sort of like follows up and raises the Sunken Tower out of the ground. So she is privy to all of Caiaphas's secrets and could potentially get something interesting done with that information. Avalanche Yeti. 2/2. Shift 6, stun 2 enemy units. They stay stunned until Avalanche Yeti emerges. So as a 2-cost 2/2, this is like fine. As a shift 6, I don't know if this is all that good. It is reasonable. You get to stun 2 enemy units for 3 turns, but I would say that that's definitely more of a draft mechanic than a ranked mechanic. Not often that you want to temporarily permafrost 2 units and then play a 2/2 later on. Like, that's okay. But yeah, it definitely does break stalls, and that is a very good reason to play it in Limited. This is something that you want to play as a 2-cost 2/2 just in general, and then you want to shift it if you draw it. Like, yeah, it feels very, very good in that scenario, and it's a strong Yeti for that reason. So overall, pretty cool. Yeti and technology should never mix, as we can see, cause avalanches. So yeah, that's a little bit rough. All right, here's a counterspell. It's called Rejection. All right. So next up is Waystone Elemental. Yeah, I knew that card was around here somewhere. So 5-cost 4/6. Waystone Elemental costs 1 less for each of your shifted units. Entomb, play 2 shifted 2/3 shardlings. So this is okay stats for a 5-cost, very good stats for a 4-cost, and if you have any shifted units, that feels pretty reasonable. I think that's quite good. I am not sure that there's a lot that you can do with that, but like since it also plays some shifted units that you can fiddle around with, let me see if I can find those shardlings. I think they're right over here. There they are. Yeah, they are just 2/3 shardlings. They don't do anything crazy. But like, oh, and they don't actually have any like legs or arms. They're just shards. Which, okay, that's cute. That's cute. But yeah, like this makes further Waystone Elementals cheaper, so it actually synergizes well with itself, and it gives you more shifted units to play with, which if you're trying to do a high shift synergy deck, this is a really good build around me for that reason. Overall, it seems like a decent winner in shift-based decks. You can do some cool stuff with it, but yeah, you have to really figure out something to do with the overall like pile of shift units that you're generating, and I'm not sure that Waystone Elemental is alone the payoff that you need. If you find a good payoff for having a lot of shifting units, that's definitely a decent option. Silver Short Sword. I think we're done with the Jack memes, by the way. We finally run out. 1/3 Entomb, you gain 3 armor. That's a decent amount of stats, actually. Like, this really supports other relic weapons and allows you to kill 2 1s and 1 1s very quickly. This card basically cleans up on Initiative Sand heavy metas, anything with a lot of like Oni Ronins. A lot of people have already started shifting towards like 3 health units as opposed to like 2 health units at 2, so there are a lot of situations where Silver Short Sword does nothing, but it's also kind of a strong card with Whetstone, which like this is the first card that we've seen that actually is a strong card with Whetstone, and like that actually feels really reasonable. The Entomb ability is very useful. Obviously, if this card dies, getting more armor to play your next relic weapon seems like a really good deal. I'd say overall this is a very solid card, and could even be better than like Sword of Icaria as an early weapon. I think it's definitely better than Talon and Nostrix, but like only in specific decks where you can actually use it, and only in metas where it's actually useful against something. Still, kills Hojin super dead, so pretty reasonable on that front. Ollie, Maniacal Grave Robber. Ollie is a 2/1 with Deadly and Quick Draw. What more do you need to know? That's ridiculous. Okay, it's also got a shift ability. Whenever one of your other units dies while Ollie is shifted, give it Voidbound and Ollie gets its strength and health. The shift ability is not that useful. It does make you a very, very large unit, so if Ollie comes out late and you don't really want to play it, then like feasibly you shift it and you make yourself a big rolling death ball with Unblockable that is also very hard to deal with later on. That's a lot of projected payoff. Like this card might just come out and get vanquished, so getting a bunch of your units killed for Ollie to get bigger is not that strong. That being said, this card is decently okay on 2. Like Deadly Quick Draw is really reasonable. This card plays well with any type of buff, and like it's just pretty okay. Like it's interesting. I think it's a decently aggressive card, but I'm not sure if there's too much that you can do with it. All right, next up we got Potion of Alacrity. Warp, your shifted units emerge 1 turn sooner. So yeah, this gives you a little bit of extra aggression on shift units. It's not terribly efficient, but like basically since it's a warp card, you will be able to play it very cheaply and get shift units a little bit quicker on that front. I think if you're playing a high shift deck, this is well worth it. Otherwise, don't bother. But yeah, overall, seems okay. Could be very, very strong in a high shift deck meta, and there are a lot of shift cards, so this seems very, very reasonable for the future. All right, we're almost at the end. We're in the home stretch. Vicious Rumors is next. This card is a 1 cost, and it is enormous. All right. So it's a 1 cost warp card, and it has the player of your choice discards the top 2 cards of their deck. So yeah, this is just like a pretty miserable warp card. Like, it plays okay in any type of mill-based deck, but like it's not anything that you want to play a lot of. It does play well with Solitude and other things like that. You can play it for free off the top of your deck. The main thing that this card is good with is the card that steals whenever your opponent discards. So if you can force discards and actually like get bonuses on the 2/3 that Dream Snatcher, if you can actually get like the extra stuff for stealing, if you can mess with your opponent's scout stuff, you know, like all of that's pretty okay, but like most of the time this card's not going to be terribly worth it. Mill cards typically aren't terribly worth it, but it's a good build around for Mill, and now that Mill has some more interactivity, I'm all for it. Okay, that leaves Death Pit. Death Pit is a 3-cost relic with all units have charge, which, oops, it's gone the wrong way. We gotta lock that down. All right. Here we go, we'll find it. Got it. Nope, that's me. Lock that down too. Different sized cards. All right, we're gonna do this the hard way. Here it comes. Death Pit is a 3-cost relic that effectively says whenever a unit is played, it has charge. So you can attack with it and do some ridiculous nonsense. So it's a little bit faster than that at coming out. And like overall, I think this card is really strong. Like Etched Monolith is a okay effect for way too much cost. This, however, is something that you can specifically do that will just like allow you to attack in with piles and piles of scary units, including all of your engines, all of the cards like the Jack the Renegade, Jack of Jackington, you know, one of the Jacks, and also like your World Bearer Behemoth, your your Yeti, your Jotun Feast colors, basically anything along those lines. You can get some really, really good benefits from it, and I think that like overall that's definitely worth it. So like Soulfire Drake, for its ability to actually give units charge, was really reasonable because it gave decks that had very, very big units lots and lots of reach. This card also gives all of your decks with lots of big units lots and lots of reach. So if you're playing with Scary Sentinels and like Heart of the Vaults, all of that kind of shenanigans, this effectively gives you just a pile of useful abilities and allows you to basically do a lot of damage in a very short period of time. So yeah, like it's not a huge investment. It's 1 card worth of disadvantage for something that allows you to play like lots and lots of advantageous Sentinels and cards that come back from the void pretty constantly, and like anything that actually gives you card advantage and is slow now becomes fast and has board impact in addition. So that's really, really strong if you want to build around very, very big units. So I think that's really cool. This card is quite playable, should actually see some play in some bigger decks. So Wormbait. Wormbait is 2-cost. Once per turn you may pay 3 and sacrifice a unit to play a shifted worm with strength and health equal to the number of units in your void. And there's the worm, +1/+1 for each unit in your void. So like overall that's decent. You can play shifted worms, but the shifted worms are in fact shifted, so that means that they don't get to attack until much, much later. So it's a lot of cost for a higher end payoff. If you're playing a lot of small tokens, this has decent payoff, but it is payoff that you get later in the game as opposed to earlier in the game. You're getting smaller and smaller, you're getting small units that get bigger and bigger over time, and then eventually you're rushing in with a worm a turn for 3, for 4, for 5, and so on and so forth until eventually you wear your opponent down and blow them up. So yeah, you can do some cool things with that, especially if you're like figuring out some interesting ways to use tokens like Temple Scribe or Talir's Favored, but like overall that's not going to be too big a deal. This is just like something where you actually get decent benefits and can do some cool stuff with it, but like I feel like this card has way too expensive of a cost for its payoff. The Wormbait deck is real, like you can actually build it, and I think that it will work if you build it entirely around Wormbait, but I don't think that's going to be a tier 1 list or anything like that, so we will see. It certainly will be fun to play, so that I'm very much into. And that leaves Reweave. That is our last card on the list. It was titled Zena. Okay, so it must have been on Zenaton's stream. 2-cost, sacrifice a unit to play a unit from your deck with the same cost or less and shift it. So effectively allows you to tutor for another unit and then play that unit and get its summon ability. But you also get to protect that unit with shift. So if you're playing something like a Talute off of a 7-drop, or a Martial Ironthorn off of a 5-drop, or an Imperial Loyalist off of a 4-drop, like if they're playing anything that actually has some sort of passive ability that you can actively use, then you've got some really interesting potential to use this to get some good benefits. You can even use this with like cool twist cards that you want to twist over and over again. Twist and shift work very well together. This card will work very well with the card that we are about to spoil next, which is good stuff. Yeah, like this card is really, really strong. It allows you to effectively easily grab a particular unit at the cost of 1 card, and then protect that unit from all forms of removal, with the exception of hailstorms, harsh rules, and like anything that actually blows things up. And that leads us into our spoiler for the night. So I gave out all of our clues. This is a hero we have seen before, has been to the Shadowlands, has the twist ability, and has come back a little bit twisted. We have actually seen the art for this card before in the campaign, so if you were savvy, you might have caught it ahead of time, and you might know who I'm talking about, even as we get into it. Siraf. A 2-cost 0/5 with pay 5, and twist Siraf to play a random unit with her strength and give it double damage. So, there's a lot to talk about with Siraf. Siraf is very similar to the previous Siraf in that she is a cheap unit with a decent amount of survivability that has a higher cost effect, but gives you something very cool for it, which is to say gives you an additional unit every time that you play it. So on a 0/5, this card will effectively allow you to pay 5 to twist to play a 1-drop unit that effect is completely random but has double damage, then a 2-drop, then a 3-drop, then a 4-drop. But the thing that gets interesting with this card is that if you can do anything to give it extra power, you can play much bigger units with much scarier things. And it is, of course, based off of the strength of the unit and not the cost of the unit. So it's not just 1-drops or 2-drops, but rather 1 strength drops, 2 strength drops, 3 strength drops. There are really interesting 1 strength drops that you might actually be really willing to get, including Berserk merchants and other shenanigans. But if you want to try to bet on a particular type of card, you have to figure out exactly what kind of strength you're aiming for and whether or not you can give it double damage. There are a lot of 5-cost cards with charge, so that's a decent option. 5 attack cards with charge are probably pretty good to be looking for. There are a lot of decent options at 3 in general, because that's where you get a lot of your sort of like mid to late game powerful cards, but also where you get a lot of your 2-drops and 1-drops. So this card can produce a lot of different things, but of course all of the things will get double damage, which means that if you are playing Siraf to do some interesting effective tactics, then like, yeah, that is going to be something that's pretty wild. Siraf can twist a total of 5 times unimpeded, at the end of which she will put out a single 5-cost unit and then explode, which isn't always that great, but like overall, like if you got 5 cards worth of advantage off of Siraf, that's a reasonable amount of advantage, and this is something that you're probably going to be pretty happy to twist. Yeah, this is a fun card to Chalice, it's a fun card to buff with Seed and Obelisk, it is a fun card to buff with Oathbook type effects or do some interesting things. Like, I think you can actually do some pretty decent stuff. You can't click on shifted units. Okay, so yeah, it's possible that you can't shift this card. But you can still Finest Hour it, still do interesting things with it. And like, overall, paying 5 to get that ability off of the card seems like it's going to be pretty reasonable. So, yeah, playing weapons on this card gets you all sorts of interesting extra benefits. It is a very survivable 2-cost card. Like at 0/5, this card is fairly hard to kill. It's not easy to silence, and it's fairly easy to like shift and do some interesting nonsense with that. Like if you want to play weapons on this card to make it a little bit cheaper or better, then you can do some pretty wild things with it. Overall, like I think that the ability to consistently play extra random units is still very, very useful. This card functions in a similar way to the previous Siraf, but does it at a slightly cheaper effect, and allows you to get some really interesting random scary units. It also is no longer restricted to justice or time units, which was one of the things that Siraf number 2 or Siraf number 1 was more capable of doing. But like this is something that like actually has like a lot of potential in decks that want to actually buff up her strength and use her ability to better effect. So good stuff. And if you have a lot of power, of course, you can shift Siraf multiple times on the turn she is played. You can play out multiple different interesting 1 or 2 drops, and yeah, do some interesting things with it. So, like, yeah, this card is randomonium. It's got a ton of interesting, fun things going on with it. I like the overall design of this card. There's definitely some cool things going on with Siraf as far as options go. Like, there are plenty of different cool cards that you can get off of it, and like the overall value of this card is definitely something that adds a lot to her strength. So I'm pretty down with this card, and like it seems like it's going to be something that definitely gets you some interesting options to explore. So very strong build around me, really fun attack patterns, and like overall should produce a lot of interesting, fun, random effects. I would say that she's not like tier 1 viable just because she is a randomizing unit generator, but overall I think she's reasonably strong and actually can generate some pretty good benefits as far as things go. The overall stat line for a 2-cost is very good, and the twisting ability is really useful as well. So this is something that you're pretty happy to play on too, just for the ability to defend yourself from attacks and get yourself a little bit of something that actually allows you to soak damage, and then you can do some pretty wild things with it afterwards, as well as like basically turn into some pretty good stuff. So yeah, I like Siraf a lot. I think that is the last spoiler for this particular setup, and we are now going to go, I think, directly into recording this and putting it on YouTube. So thank you guys so much for watching, and for the Twitch folks, we'll probably play a couple more games, but for the YouTube folks, I will see you on the Dark Frontier tomorrow. We will be doing an all-day stream, and yeah, we will be playing this for quite some time, trying to get our hands on the new Siraf. So good stuff.